Picture this. You're standing in the grand halls of Topkapi Palace in 1650, surrounded by marble columns that reach toward painted ceilings, depicting paradise itself. The air is thick with the scent of roses and sandalwood, and silk tapestries worth more than entire kingdoms shimmer in the filtered sunlight. Young boys in jeweled turbans glide past like ethereal spirits, their movements graceful and practiced, their eyes downcast in perfect submission. To the casual observer, this looks like the height of civilization, the pinnacle of Ottoman sophistication and refinement. But if you could peer beneath the surface of this magnificent facade, if you could hear the whispered conversations in darkened corridors, and understand the coded glances exchanged between these beautiful young men, you would discover a truth so disturbing that it would shatter every romanticized notion you've ever held about palace life. These boys, some barely past childhood, are living in what can only be described as a golden prison where beauty becomes a curse and education comes at the cost of innocence. Welcome to the hidden world of Ottoman male concubines, where the empire's most promising young men were transformed into living works of art, educated to perfection, and then systematically exploited by the very system that claimed to elevate them. This isn't the sanitized version you'll find in history textbooks or museum displays. This is the raw, unfiltered reality of what it meant to be chosen for imperial service in one of history's most powerful empires. Before we dive deeper into these forgotten stories, if you're fascinated by the darker truths hidden beneath history's glossy surface, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content that reveals what really happened behind palace walls. Please drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It's incredible that we can explore these ancient secrets together from all corners of the globe, connected by our shared curiosity about the stories that history tried to bury. The journey to becoming an Ottoman palace favorite began not with opportunity, but with catastrophe. Imagine being a shepherd boy in the rolling hills of Serbia or the son of a blacksmith in rural Bulgaria. Your days are simple but secure, filled with familiar faces and the comforting routines of village life. Then, without warning, everything you've ever known disappears in a single morning when Ottoman officials arrive with their lists and their cold, calculating eyes. The devshirme system, as it was officially known, was presented as a form of taxation, but it was actually something far more sinister. Every few years, imperial agents would sweep through Christian territories, systematically selecting the most beautiful and intelligent boys to serve the Sultan's needs. They called it an honor, a chance for peasant children to rise to positions of power and influence. But the reality was recruitment through kidnapping, advancement through exploitation, and success measured by how completely you could surrender your former self. The selection process itself was humiliating beyond imagination. Boys as young as 8 would be lined up like livestock at a market, their teeth examined, their reflexes tested, their faces scrutinized for the kind of beauty that would catch the eye of palace officials. The criteria weren't just about intelligence or potential for learning. Physical attractiveness was paramount, because these boys weren't just being chosen for their minds. They were being selected as objects of desire for men who wielded absolute power over their lives. Those deemed suitable for palace service were immediately separated from their families, often before they could even say goodbye. A march to Istanbul could take weeks, and it served as the first phase of psychological conditioning. Boys who had never walked more than a few miles from their birthplace were forced to travel hundreds of miles on foot, inadequately fed and constantly reminded of their new status as property of the empire. The weak ones didn't survive the journey. Those who fell ill, who couldn't keep pace, or who simply gave up hope were abandoned by the roadside like broken tools. This wasn't an accident of poor planning. It was deliberate selection pressure designed to ensure that only the most resilient, adaptable, and psychologically malleable boys reached the palace gates. Upon arrival in Istanbul, the surviving boys faced their first real glimpse of what their new lives would entail. The Enderun school, housed within the walls of Topkapi Palace, was presented as an elite educational institution where the empire's future administrators would be trained. And in many ways, this description was accurate. The curriculum was sophisticated by any standard, covering languages, mathematics, astronomy, literature, law, music, and various crafts. But education in the Ottoman palace came with strings attached that would bind these boys for the rest of their lives. The first lesson they learned had nothing to do with books or languages. It was about power, submission, and the complete erasure of their former identities. Their Christian names were replaced with Islamic ones. Their native languages were forbidden. Their memories of home became sources of shame rather than comfort. The dormitories where they slept were architectural marvels of marble and silk, but they were also carefully designed instruments of control. Privacy was non-existent. Every moment was monitored, every conversation overheard, every emotional response noted and evaluated. The boys learned quickly that survival depended not just on academic achievement, but on their ability to please their superiors in ways that went far beyond scholarly performance. The palace operated on a complex hierarchy where advancement required navigating relationships that would be considered criminal by any modern standard. Older students, themselves victims of the same system just a few years earlier, held considerable power over newcomers. They had learned that their own survival often depended on their ability to exploit those below them in the chain of command. These older boys would approach the frightened newcomers with offers of protection and guidance. They would explain the unwritten rules of palace life, share tips for avoiding punishment, and promise to speak favorably of promising younger students to the teachers who controlled their fates. But this protection came with a price that no child should ever have to pay. The system created an environment where sexual exploitation was not just tolerated, but integrated into the very structure of daily life. Boys who caught the attention of powerful patrons found their studies easier, their living conditions more comfortable, their prospects for advancement significantly improved. Those who resisted or failed to please their superiors faced isolation, harsh punishment, and the gradual destruction of any hope for a better future. What made this system particularly insidious was how it masked exploitation as opportunity. The boys really were receiving an education that was exceptional by the standards of their time. They were learning skills that would serve them throughout their lives, gaining access to knowledge and training that would have been impossible in their villages of origin. But this genuine advancement was inseparable from systematic abuse that left psychological scars lasting far beyond their palace years. The palace officials who ran this system had perfected the art of psychological manipulation over generations of practice. They understood exactly how to break down a child's resistance while building up their dependence on the institution that was exploiting them. They knew how to make boys grateful for their captivity, proud of their education, and complicit in perpetuating the very system that had damaged them. European visitors who occasionally glimpsed this world left accounts that reveal both fascination and discomfort with what they witnessed. They wrote of seeing boys as young as 10 dressed in silk and jewels, attending to older men with a familiarity that suggested relationships extending far beyond appropriate boundaries. But these observations were filtered through their own cultural biases and limited understanding of what they were really seeing. The full horror of this system becomes clear only when we understand that it was hidden or secret. It was an open institution, celebrated for its effectiveness and defended by those who benefited from its operations. The systematic abuse of thousands of boys was not a corruption of the system, but its fundamental operating principle. The transformation these boys underwent went far beyond mere education or cultural assimilation. It was a calculated dismantling of everything that made them human individuals, followed by a meticulous reconstruction designed to serve imperial appetites. Every aspect of their former selves became a liability to be eliminated, every natural impulse a weakness to be exploited or corrected. The morning routine began before dawn with prayers they had been forced to memorize in languages that still felt foreign on their tongues. The boys would line up in perfect formation, their movements choreographed through months of painful conditioning. Any deviation from the prescribed postures, any hesitation in reciting the required verses, any sign of longing for their abandoned faith would result in swift and brutal correction. Breakfast was served in magnificent halls where golden utensils caught the morning light streaming through stained glass windows. The food was abundant and exotic compared to what they had known in their villages, but even meals became exercises in submission and control. They ate in complete silence, their portions carefully measured, their behavior constantly observed by supervisors, who took notes on everything from how they held their spoons to how they chewed their food. The academic sessions that followed were genuinely rigorous and comprehensive. These boys were being prepared to serve at the highest levels of imperial administration, and their education reflected that ambition. They studied Arabic calligraphy until their fingers bled from gripping the reed pens, memorized thousands of lines of Persian poetry, and mastered mathematical concepts that would have challenged university students in Europe. But academic achievement alone was never enough. The boys quickly learned that intellectual brilliance without physical compliance was worthless in the palace hierarchy. Teachers would call promising students to private tutoring sessions that had nothing to do with scholarship. These encounters, conducted behind closed doors in chambers decorated with priceless carpets and illuminated manuscripts, taught lessons that would never appear in any curriculum. The most beautiful boys faced the greatest dangers and the most complex choices. Their physical attractiveness made them valuable commodities in the palace's internal economy of favor and influence, but it also made them targets for exploitation that could destroy them if they weren't careful. They learned to navigate conversations loaded with double meanings, to recognize the difference between genuine educational opportunity and predatory manipulation, to calculate the precise amount of submission required to survive without losing themselves entirely. Some boys tried to make themselves less attractive, deliberately scarring their faces or adopting awkward postures to avoid unwanted attention. But the palace officials were experienced in dealing with such resistance. Boys who attempted to diminish their appeal faced punishments designed not just to correct their behavior, but to serve as warnings to others. They might be forced to stand naked in courtyards while other students mocked them, or confined to chambers barely large enough to lie down in, fed on bread and water until they reconsidered their choices. The psychological pressure was relentless and expertly applied. The boys were cut off from any source of support or validation outside the palace walls. Their families were forbidden to contact them. Their former communities became distant memories, and their only relationships were with other victims of the same system, or with the perpetrators who controlled their daily lives. This isolation made them completely dependent on their captors for any sense of worth or identity. When a teacher praised their calligraphy or a supervisor complimented their deportment, it felt like salvation after months of criticism and correction. When an older student offered friendship or protection, it seemed like a lifeline in an ocean of hostility and competition. The palace cultivated this dependence systematically, offering small privileges and freedoms as rewards for compliance, while making it clear that these gifts could be withdrawn at any moment. A boy who pleased his instructors might be allowed to sleep on silk sheets instead of rough cotton, or given access to books of poetry that reminded him of the beauty that still existed in the world. These tiny improvements in their circumstances felt enormous to boys who had been systematically deprived of comfort and dignity. The most successful students learned to excel at what we might now recognize as emotional manipulation. They developed an almost supernatural ability to read the moods and desires of their superiors, adapting their behavior moment by moment to provide exactly what was expected. They became masters of performance, presenting different versions of themselves to different audiences, always calculating which persona would be most effective in any given situation. This constant performance took a devastating toll on their psychological development. Many boys began to lose track of who they really were beneath all the masks they wore for survival. They would lie awake at night trying to remember their mothers' faces or the sound of bells in their village churches. But these memories grew fainter with each passing month until they seemed like dreams from someone else's life. The palace's daily schedule was designed to prevent exactly this kind of reflection. Every moment was accounted for, every activity supervised, every thought channeled toward approved subjects. Physical exercise sessions doubled as opportunities for officials to evaluate the boys' developing bodies. Music lessons became performances for audiences who were more interested in the performers than the performances. Even prayer times were monitored to ensure that devotion was being properly expressed and channeled. The boys learned to communicate in codes and subtle signals that allowed them to share information and emotional support without attracting the attention of their supervisors. A particular way of holding a book might indicate that someone was struggling with their lessons. A specific gesture during prayers could signal that a boy was planning something dangerous and needed to be watched or warned. These underground networks of communication provided some sense of solidarity and shared humanity in an environment designed to eliminate both. But even these secret connections were dangerous. The palace authorities encouraged boys to inform on each other, offering rewards and privileges to those who reported violations of rules or signs of resistance among their peers. This system of mutual surveillance meant that trust became a luxury that few could afford, and friendships were always shadowed by the possibility of betrayal. The most heartbreaking aspect of this environment was watching boys gradually transform from frightened children into calculating survivors who had learned to see exploitation as opportunity and abuse as education. They would rationalize their circumstances, telling themselves and each other that they were receiving advantages that their village-bound peers could never access, that their suffering was temporary, and their eventual success would justify any price they had to pay. Those who showed particular promise or beauty faced an even more disturbing reality as they advanced through the palace hierarchy. The graduation ceremony, known as chikma, marked not the end of their ordeal, but its transformation into something more sophisticated and devastating. These young men, now fluent in multiple languages and skilled in the arts of diplomacy and administration, discovered that their real education was just beginning. The palace's upper echelons operated according to rules that made their earlier experiences seem almost innocent by comparison. Here, sexual relationships weren't just about exploitation. They were currency in a complex economy of political advancement and imperial favor. The most successful graduates learned to navigate this world with the calculating precision of seasoned courtiers, understanding that their bodies and their compliance were valuable assets to be strategically deployed. Picture Ahmed, a boy who had been taken from a Serbian village at age 10 and had spent 8 years perfecting himself according to palace standards. By 18, he spoke 6 languages fluently, could recite thousands of lines of classical poetry from memory, and moved through the marble corridors with the grace of a dancer. His calligraphy was so exquisite that senior officials competed to have him prepare their correspondence. His mathematical abilities had impressed even the palace's most demanding tutors. But Ahmed's greatest asset wasn't his intellectual brilliance. It was his face. Years of careful grooming, proper nutrition, and strategic cosmetic enhancement had transformed him into something approaching artistic perfection. His skin was pale as moonlight, his eyes rimmed with kohl that made them appear impossibly large and luminous, his movements choreographed to suggest both innocence and availability. He had become exactly what the system designed him to be, a living work of art created for the pleasure of powerful men. The transition from student to palace favorite brought luxuries that would have seemed impossible during his early years of training. Ahmed now slept in a private chamber decorated with Persian carpets and illuminated manuscripts. His clothing was silk and velvet, adorned with jewels that caught the light as he moved. He dined on delicacies prepared by the empire's finest cooks and drank from goblets crafted by master artisans. But these privileges came with expectations that grew more demanding and degrading with each passing day. Ahmed's schedule was no longer filled with formal lessons, but with private audiences that served the personal needs of high-ranking officials. He might spend an afternoon reading poetry to a vizier who seemed more interested in the reader than the verses. Evening might bring summons to entertainment functions, where his role was to provide companionship of a distinctly intimate nature. The palace had perfected the art of making this exploitation seem like honor and advancement. Officials spoke of the special relationships they formed with their favorites as mentorship and patronage. They described the intimate services these young men provided as expressions of loyalty and gratitude. The vocabulary of abuse was carefully sanitized to sound like opportunity and privilege. Ahmed learned to smile during encounters that left him feeling hollow and degraded. He perfected the art of appearing enthusiastic about activities that revolted him. He developed techniques for disconnecting his mind from his body during the worst moments, imagining himself back in the Serbian hills of his childhood, or floating above the ornate chambers where his dignity was systematically destroyed. The psychological toll of this existence was carefully managed by palace authorities, who understood that broken favorites were less valuable than those who maintained some semblance of vitality and charm. Ahmed was provided with diversions and compensations designed to keep him functional and compliant. He had access to books that transported him to other worlds, music that soothed his damaged spirit, and artistic pursuits that allowed him to express beauty, even as his own innocence was being systematically consumed. Other graduates faced different, but equally disturbing fates. Those assigned to military service discovered that the Janissary Corps, while famous for its discipline and effectiveness, operated according to its own brutal hierarchies of domination and submission. New recruits faced initiation rituals that combined military training with sexual humiliation, designed to break down individual will and create absolute loyalty to the unit. The barracks where these young men lived were worlds unto themselves, governed by codes of behavior that had evolved over generations of institutionalized abuse. Senior Janissaries wielded complete authority over recruits, demanding services that went far beyond military duties. The same boys who had learned to please palace officials now had to adapt to the cruder, but no less systematic exploitation of military life. Combat training became another form of performance, where physical prowess was evaluated alongside willingness to submit to authority in all its forms. Young Janissaries learned to fight with deadly efficiency while maintaining the psychological flexibility that allowed them to serve their superiors in whatever capacity was demanded. The warrior ethos of the Corps was built on foundations of sexual exploitation that created bonds of shared trauma, disguised as military brotherhood. Those who survived and thrived in this environment often became its most enthusiastic perpetrators. Men who had once been terrified children torn from their families transformed into predators who selected and groomed the next generation of victims. They justified their actions by pointing to their own advancement, their military achievements, their positions of respect within the imperial hierarchy. The empire, as administrative apparatus, was similarly corrupted by graduates of the palace system, who carried their psychological damage into positions of civil authority. Provincial governors who had learned to please superiors through sexual compliance often imposed similar expectations on their own subordinates. The patterns of exploitation that began in the palace dormitories spread throughout the imperial bureaucracy like a virus that infected every level of government. European diplomats who interacted with these officials often noted their sophisticated manners and impressive capabilities while remaining puzzled by undercurrents they could not quite identify. They described Ottoman administrators as remarkably cultured and educated, but sensed something unsettling in their relationships with younger staff members and their approaches to authority and submission. The most successful palace graduates developed what modern psychology might recognize as complex survival mechanisms that allowed them to function in a world where their humanity had been systematically compromised. They learned to compartmentalize their experiences, separating their public personas from their private anguish, their professional achievements from their personal degradation. Some found solace in religious mysticism, interpreting their suffering through spiritual frameworks that gave meaning to their pain. They joined Sufi orders that emphasized surrender to divine will, finding in religious submission an echo of the sexual submission that had defined their lives. Their poetry and philosophical writings, when they dared to create such things, often contained coded references to their experiences that only fellow survivors could fully understand. Others channeled their trauma into artistic expression, creating works of breathtaking beauty that served as monuments to their lost innocence. The calligraphy, miniature paintings, and architectural designs that emerged from this world of systematic abuse often contained subtle symbols and hidden meanings that spoke to those who had shared similar experiences. The palace's influence extended beyond its immediate victims to shape the broader culture of the empire in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. The normalization of age-disparate relationships, the elevation of physical beauty to quasi-religious status, the complex codes of behavior that governed interactions between men of different social ranks, all reflected the values and practices that had been perfected within the palace walls. Marriage customs among the elite were influenced by palace practices that treated younger partners as acquisitions to be trained and molded rather than equals to be respected. The empire's artistic traditions reflected aesthetic preferences shaped by the systematic objectification of young male beauty. Even religious practices were affected by theological interpretations that rationalized the exploitation of the powerless by the powerful. The system's most insidious achievement was its ability to make victims complicit in their own exploitation and eager to perpetuate it. Boys who had been broken by the palace hierarchy often became its most effective recruiters and enforcers, using their understanding of trauma and manipulation to identify and groom the next generation of victims. They would return to their regions of origin as successful officials, displaying their wealth and status to communities that had once pitied their families for losing sons to the devshirme. These success stories became powerful propaganda tools that made other families more willing to surrender their children, believing that palace service offered opportunities that outweighed its costs. The tragic irony was that these returnees often became the most effective instruments of the system's expansion, using their intimate knowledge of local customs and family structures to identify the most promising candidates for recruitment. They understood exactly what kind of boy would survive the palace's demands and what kind would be destroyed by them, making their selections with the clinical precision of experienced predators. The palace walls that had witnessed centuries of systematic abuse maintained their secrets long after the practices they housed had evolved or disappeared. The beautiful chambers where education and exploitation had intertwined became museums where visitors admired architectural achievements without understanding the human cost of the civilization that had created them.